has legitimated the economic, social, and ideological denigration of Blackness. And this is particularly important because, especially in the context of the United States, really irrespective of ideology, Black assertion is considered to be a form of radicalism because it is a fundamental challenge to the white supremacy that is foundational to and constitutive of the United States. In terms of the Red Scare, I understand this as the criminalization and condemnation of anti-capitalist ideas, politics, and/or practices through discourses of radical takeover, of infiltration, and disruption of the American way of life, as a means of maintaining a society organized along class and race lines, and dominated by a majority white capitalist elite. After 1917, the Red Scare was prominently articulated through the specter of the communist or the Bolshevist and the fellow traveler, so one who didn't necessarily belong to a party, but who espoused those ideas. The Red Scare is a process by which a fear, hatred, and obsession with communism and with radicalism writ large helped to mold the United States into what it became throughout the 20th century and even extending into the 21st century, and whereby militant challenges to the status quo came to represent a danger to the nation attributed to agitators or plotters or traitors or conspirators. And so governance aimed at managing and criminalizing racial and political others who threaten to upend or transform the racialized class order actually stoked white supremacy and cross-class collaboration among white folks that has obfuscated economic exploitation in the interest of the ruling class. So this is the basis of the anti-communist mode of governance, which includes all three branches of government, also state and local governments, and has been maintained through repressive action, intentional inaction, and also stifling reaction. So anti-communism as a mode of governance fuses public authority and societal self-regulation to diffuse throughout society penalty for and the marginalization, regulation, and criminalization of ideas and beliefs that, because they challenge racial capitalism, and its foundations, not least racial hierarchy, economic inequality, and class antagonism, are rendered communist and therefore antithetical to or threatening or dangerous to like true Americanism. So public authority is manifested in like legislation, federal and Supreme Court decisions, surveillance by government agencies, presidential executive orders, and also ubiquitous federal and state congressional investigative committees. And so these were especially prominent during the era of the first, what we might call the first Cold War at this point, because we're probably barreling toward another, if not already firmly in one. So anti-communist governance is facilitated through an anti-radical state apparatus that encompasses all three branches of government. And then, of course, public authority aims to eject, punish, and neutralize communists and their fellow travelers and sympathizers. And those were broad designations that included anybody who criticized or sought to transform racial capitalist society. And this included peace activists, civil rights leaders, dissident artists, and progressive labor organizers of all types. So that is to say that anti-communism is not just about communists, it's about people who are challenging some aspect of the status quo who can then be red-baited as communists, right? To protect racial capitalism against the threat of radical transformation. In effect, anti-communist governance is a product of 2 world wars and numerous revolutions that reflected a failure of the United States to adjust to power, political, or revolutionary ramifications that confronted the 20th century world and now the 21st century. In other words, anti-communist governance is a backlash to these phenomena. As such, anti-communism imposes a uniformity on communism and all that is said to be linked to it, positioning them as a preeminent threat to US national security and societal organization. And that then encourages an international strategy of military containment and rollback. Domestically, rigid and repressive opposition to change and imposition of adherence to the status quo allow for the vehement attack and discrediting of even reformist ideas and policies. Historically, this is like the New Deal, and the erasure of any distinction between act, intention, and ideas. And importantly, property, through this regime, property becomes conflated with sort of life or human life, such that an attack on property takes on an enormous challenge to the state, right? Disloyalty, danger, and subversion also become these mutually reinforcing charges that uphold the discipline and punishment that emanates from anti-communist governance. In addition to public authority, anti-communist governance is practiced through societal self-regulation or soft power, insofar as the mere existence of anti-radical laws or restraints cast a shadow far beyond their literal reach. So hundreds of thousands of individuals live in fear and hold their thoughts and opinions to themselves because the atmosphere of freedom is poisoned by the fact that repressive laws are passed, right? And so, for example, people might not want to join a march or protest, or might feel that they need to speak out against something that is characterized as communist or radical, like Black Lives Matter, for example, simply because laws and policies exist that repress them. So the soft power of anti-communist governance means that racially and politically minoritized people are forced to genuflect to the status quo, lest they be marginalized, excluded, criminalized, physically attacked, or worse. Likewise, ordinary citizens under the influence of anti-communist governance are conditioned to be hostile to and prejudiced against communities and other communists and other political militants, and to enact private anti-communist actions. These individuals include landlords, private employers, book publishers, those working in mass media, teachers, all around, right? People espouse this rhetoric about communism or socialism that they know nothing about, but this is because they're conditioned by the extant society. And of course, the persecution of communists and those deemed communists or red-baited and their right to free speech has especially dire consequences for Black people, for who the right to dissent and disagree is essential to challenging white supremacy and specific enunciations of anti-Black racism. And so while the Cold War atmosphere, assisted by waves of repressive laws and congressional investigative committees, victimized hundreds, if not thousands of people who are communists and anti-communist alike, it was actually entry into World War I that sacralized anti-radicalism and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 that incited radicalism to become increasingly identified with communism. So the counter-subversive political tradition that I mentioned earlier, after that moment, became governed through anti-communism. And then Bolshevism became the sort of preeminent boogeyman insofar as at that moment, the United States found itself confronting a large, potentially powerful nation governed by communists, committed to an ideological position hostile to bedrock American values, and that fear of an ideologically alien foreign power linked with the subversive domestic movement suddenly seemed grounded in reality. So in other words, 1917 is sort of this takeoff moment for the ubiquity and entrenchment of anti-communism. And though some laws are indeed addressed exclusively toward communism, the long history of US anti-radicalism means that the anti-communist mode of governance also targets a wide spectrum of political beliefs and association, especially those committed to racial and economic justice and internationalism. Anti-communist governance therefore exceeds the so-called imperative of managing a small minority of communists from attempting to ostensibly overthrow the US government by force or violence, and from eroding the American way of life. In reality, what anti-communism does is transform anything counter-hegemonic or non-conforming into subversion, foreignness, or disloyalty by punishing it as communist inspired or communist infiltrated, and therefore illegal, illicit, or criminal. As such, US racial capitalism and the society that it engenders is one of the most repressive of all Western countries. It has adopted legislation and practices that actually repress democratic liberties more so than any other country in the West. It has refused to accommodate not only communism, but dissenting thought and actions of all kinds. And this is relatively, it's not that it's only the United States, but it's relatively unique to the United States. And the United States actually has imported those policies abroad through its practices of imperialism. So the United States government legitimates repressive domestic and interventionist foreign policy through aggressive rhetoric, coercion of loyalty, grilling people on whether or not they are communists, and if they are considered to be communist or have been communist or socialist or whatever. They're sort of hampered from holding leadership positions. And then there's also widespread prosecution and persecution. So anti-communist governance means that those who are accused, indicted, or found guilty of violating the wide array of anti-communist legislation, policy, and practice are subjected to severe restriction and enormous penalty, not least harassment, ostracism, loss of work, and livelihood, as well as income. It also calls into question who is deserving of and who can be denied rights and liberties based on beliefs, and thus provided a power. And so anti-communism just provides a powerful check on the ostensible freedoms we're supposed to hold, like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, due process, and protection against self-incrimination. So this Red Scare logic, which informs and is informed by the Black Scare, is foundational to the passage of repressive legislation that helps to sweep racial militancy, worker agitation, and progressive policy into a sort of dragnet of repression or condemnation. And we see this, for example, with like critical race theory. And just to wrap it up, anti-communist governance is especially, though not exclusively, top-down in its character. In other words, it's popular but not populist, and emanates from the upper echelons of society, namely the federal government, and is dispersed downward. And so support for anti-communist governance is garnered through the harnessing of anti-reformist sentiment to concerns about national security. Federal anti-communism in turn gives rise to derivative anti-communist politics at the state and local levels, not least because organizations that lobby for and support federal anti-communism writ large are also active at those other levels. Likewise, state and even some municipal legislators respond very closely to the force of the federal law to implement new or reinvigorate old anti-radical legislation that has been molded from federal legislation or that which is in use in other states. And so, for example, we see this with like these anti-protest laws that are cropping up in places like Florida. And so what we need to understand is that this legislation is very much in place, which is why I emphasize that anti-communism as a mode of governance is not just about communism. We still see these logics operating very much today and targeting for, Black Lives Matter, which is by no means a communist organization. And we see this happening internationally with like attacks on Venezuela, attacks on Cuba, attacks on North Korea. And so this anti-communism as a mode of governance, as a way of sort of implementing rule over society, both domestically and internationally, is very strong and very ubiquitous. It has a very long history and it still continues into the present. And so I hope these kind of brief remarks have helped to provide some framing to your overall panel. And I thank you all for listening to me today.
Once again, that was Dr. Charisse Bertistelli with the heat, talking about how the ruling class in the United States intentionally cultivated and weaponized anti-communism to attack radical movements, not just communist movements, but all of the movements pushing for reform. So I'm going to pass it over to Nick to introduce our panelists so we can get this conversation going.
Hey y'all, I'm Nick, and I'm going to be introducing the folks we'll all be hearing from today. First off, we've got Erica. Erica Keynes is a coordinating committee and outreach team member of the Black Alliance for Peace, as well as an outreach member of the Black working class centered Ujima People's Progress Party in Maryland. Keynes is the founder of Liberation Through Reading. She is also co-editor of the African revolutionary blog Hood Communist. Next, we've got Ramiro. Ramiro is a Honduran communist content creator based in Los Angeles, California. He's the producer and director of Nicaragua Against Empire, a documentary series that highlights Nicaraguan resistance to Western imperialism. And then lastly, we've got Oliver. Oliver is an organizer and educator. He's a member of the Allegheny's Abolition, a group organizing against capitalism and imperialism in so-called Central PA. Oliver also helps from afar with the John Brown Breakfast Club, an abolition project in Albuquerque, Equal Aid and Defense for Poor and Unsheltered Residents. And I, for one, am really looking forward to hearing from you all. I'm gonna pass it back to my comrade Oni, who will ask our first question.
Sorry, I accidentally spotlit both of the ASL interpreters, so let me make sure that the panelists are spotlit as well. There we go. Cool. All right, sorry about that. So to start off the panel, first question we have for y'all is first, for the benefit of people that don't know what we're talking about, can you explain what anti-communism is? And second is, what is a particular present or historical moment that stands out to you as an illustrative example of US imperialism, anti-communism, and the connection between them? And what lesson does this moment provide? And I'll put that question in the chat as well.
Anybody feeling called to start first?
I will call on one of you. Erica. Are you frozen?
I can attempt. So the way I understand anti-communism is it's basically what Charisse laid out. It's basically its own political ideology, but it's in opposition to what communism is. If we understand communism, it's where it's basically the goal. Socialism is a project that leads towards communism, but socialism would be like the control, where the workers have the control of the means of production. The workers of the proletariat would be like the rule. And communism is basically like a stateless society where people have sovereignty and control of their means. So anti-communism would just be in opposition to any of that. And that's the way I interpret it. So if someone wants to correct me or maybe fine tune it, but I think that's like the simplest way I could describe it, just based off what the detailed definition that. Did you want me to go on further though with the?
Yeah, if you can think of any present or historical examples of how US imperialism uses anti-communism, feel free to share. Otherwise, you can pass it to someone else.
Yeah, so just to continue on with the question, when I talk about like anti-communism being in opposition to any sort of sovereignty, we can look at the reemergence of the pink tide in Latin America and the efforts of the West, specifically the US, to squander it using sanctions, backing coup attempts, backing actual coup, interference in electoral processes using the core group, which is like a cartel of nations that continue to control institutions and laws within these nations, and also the OAS, whose alleged purposes of solidarity is also to move in the same way. On Black Lives for Peace, I didn't mention in my bio because I'm trying to cut it short, but I'm also a part of the Haiti in the Americas team, where we specifically focus on that general area using Haiti as the foundation to discuss the entire Americas. If you were listening to what Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly just said, in this sort of Black Scare, Red Scare format, the fare of Haiti dictates the way that the U.S. maneuvers around the west of that region. For instance, how close Haiti is to Cuba, the relationship that Haiti has with Venezuela via Petrocaribe, which the U.S. backed and now deceased Moïse sucked dry. So what we try to do is really expose that a lot of the conversations had around these nations in their internal processes are far removed from the West and the US specifically, and their end goal of just spreading their hegemony in that region for control purposes. And they use the tactics of anti-communism as the way to do that, because a lot of these nations are developing socialist projects. So even when I talk about Haiti, Haiti itself might not be a socialist nation, but the proximity, the relationship that it has with nations that are building or developing socialist projects, the thought that Haiti could possibly even want to or could have the means to do that is what frightens the US. And that's why we see the expansion of a Southcom in that region, the military presence, or that's why we see continuous sanctions, especially what's going on currently in Nicaragua. So we can see current and, current examples, especially when we look at their relationship post-pandemic, well, not post-pandemic, but post-2020 with China and the US's aggression towards that nation. So yeah, so that's some examples I can give.
Oliver or Ramiro, do either of you have thoughts on this question?
Yeah. I thank you so much, Comrade Oni, to Comrade Erica, and also the comrade at the beginning of the program who spoke and gave a wonderful presentation. I think she broke it down very well. I think that in order to define anti-communism, we first have to define imperialism. And imperialism can date back to the late 1800s. But in 1917, Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, wrote a beautiful pamphlet called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And he wrote this on the eve of the Russian Revolution, where he described imperialism as the formation of oligopoly, the interlacing of bank and industrial capital, creating a financial oligarchy, the banking monopoly elites who run the world, JP Morgan, the IMF, the World Bank, these financial institutions that surpass the industrial capitalist, because within the capitalist class, the ruling economic class, you have the industrial capitalist, people who own factories and own the means of production. With imperialism, you have a higher stage. You have AIG, you have the major insurance companies, HSBC, the bank that funded the opium wars in China. You have these financial institutions that don't even create a product and are doing what's called money magic. They're using numbers and crunching numbers to make profits around the world on economies in the global south, and they run the entire world. And this is what Lenin outlined in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And obviously, the socialist and communist movement has fought very fiercely against imperialism and has been the fiercest attackers of imperialism. And I think one example that is crucial to understanding imperialism and its connections with anti-communism is something that's not really talked about within the left, and that is the role of racism, and more particularly of Zionism. And just as we've mentioned, Red Scare and Black Scare, just as much as the US government was fearful and was racist and was very segregationist and enslaved Africans and Black and brown people in the US, we can also apply this to Palestine and the creation of the state of Israel, the quote unquote state of Israel. And this is important to mention and to learn about, because when we understand the role of Zionism, I think Zionism is a great example of the interconnection between anti-communism and imperialism. We can begin to understand why today the quote unquote state of Israel continues to expand on stolen Palestinian territory, why evangelical right-wing pro-Israel presidents in the US, from Bolsonaro to Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras to Duque to so many others, are supporting US foreign policy in Israel. And this all goes back to the same year that Lenin published Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, 1917, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a secret treaty between the UK and France, which basically carved up what was then the Ottoman Empire after World War I. And the Soviet Union, the first socialist republic, the first socialist country in the world, was the first nation to expose that. And the Sykes-Picot Agreement was backed by the World Zionist Organization. It was declared by Mark Sykes, who was a Conservative Party politician from the UK. He was backed by the World Zionist Organization, and he drafted the Balfour Declaration, which basically called for a, quote, national home for the Jewish people. Of course, we know it doesn't truly represent the Jewish people, but instead represents only the international financial elites who sought to use occupied Palestine as the new banking capital of global international capitalism. And the Soviet Union, by exposing this, it essentially, what it did is it garnered anger and solidarity among the Arab nations to resist Zionism, to resist Israel, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And the Soviet Union and the communists have always been on the side of anti-Zionism, of anti-imperialism, because fundamentally Zionism is based on this racist idea that Palestinians and Arabs are subhuman, that they don't belong on their own land, and that others should go and settle there. And later on, it's really interesting because I think this is part of a history that's not really talked about. Toward the 1950s, Israel played a major role in what is called the World Anti-Communist League. And the World Anti-Communist League was a non-governmental organization of communist politicians and groups in 1952. This is after World War II. This is after the creation of the State of Israel. The State of Israel knew that it had to fund anti-communism because communists are fundamentally against imperialism and Zionism, and which the State of Israel is an imperialist Zionist project. And the World Anti-Communist League was founded by Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Republic of Taiwan, which is part of China, which is essentially part of the People's Republic of China, occupied China. And also another representative of the World Anti-Communist League was Syngman Rhee of the Republic of Korea. And Syngman Rhee was an evangelical right-wing, pro-US, pro-UK, pro-Israel imperialist who is responsible for the deaths of at least 100,000 people, the Jeju Massacre in 1948. A lot of things were happening at this time, and the World Anti-Communist League, with the support of Israel, was attacking communists. And so at this point, after World War II, after the Soviet victory, when communism was extremely popular, everyone in the world wanted to build socialism, two tendencies emerged. There was the openly right-wing fascist evangelical pro-Israel tendency embodied by the World Anti-Communist League, right? These are the people who supported the Contras in Iran. These are the people who supported Guatemalan right-wing dictator Efraín Ríos Montt and Reagan, who murdered indigenous peoples by the thousands, murdered Palestinians. Then you have another wing, which I think is a more dangerous wing, in my opinion. And this is the liberal, imperialist, social, democratic, anti-communist wing, embodied by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, an anti-communist advocacy group founded in the 1950s. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was active in 35 countries, and the CIA was supporting it for many years. They funded postmodernism. They funded what they called anti-authoritarian studies. Some of the major leaders were Sidney Hook and Irving Kristol. Sidney Hook was what he called himself a pragmatic social democrat. He worked with the CIA. He also, interestingly enough, worked for the ACLU. And he is somebody who called for openly, and he called for trials against communists in the US. He said they were anti-democratic and that communists should be punished by the US government. And this is somebody who called himself a socialist. Irving Kristol, an American journalist who was known as the godfather of neoconservatism, a former Trotskyite, and he also was a supporter of Israel and Zionism. And they also supported the Frankfurt School, which promoted this anti-communist, postmodern, liberal approach that, okay, we know capitalism and imperialism are bad, but so is socialism, so is communism. And that was a very useful and effective weapon that manifested and gained a lot of hold in the 1980s with the color revolutions, with the overthrow of the Soviet Union, and to this day remains the dominant and most threatening form of anti-communism, which we're seeing play out today, as Comrade Erica mentioned earlier. They're using it right now against Nicaragua. They're saying that the opposition, the right wing Contras are pro-democracy freedom fighters. Are saying Ortega's a dictator. They're saying the same about Venezuela and Cuba. They're appropriating the images, the iconography of the anti-imperialist left and using it for imperialism. So these are more or less the two tendencies within anti-communism: the right-wing evangelical, openly fascist sector, and then the liberal social imperialist hipster faction that I like to call it. And I just wanted to kind of mention that from the beginning because I think it's important to attack both. This is a two-headed snake that we're talking about.
And I'll just quickly add, and I just want to say before, like, thanks again for inviting me, and it's a real honor to be here, and I'm excited to kind of learn from you all and also share some thoughts. So this panel, when I saw the theme, I was like, oh, okay, this is pretty cool. Like, this is a much needed topic to study and discuss. So, I mean, I think, and I don't want to repeat too much, but I would echo, I think what you all have already said in terms of, like, a good definition of what anti-communism is. I would only add that, I think of it as, it's like a ruling class strategy, right? And it's in response to, dispossessed people, colonized people, poor people, working people, their attempts to get free. This mode of governance that Dr. CBS talks about, that is an anti-communist mode of governance, it's a counteraction. It's in response to people who have already organized, try to get free. So it's a very old, kind of tactic or strategy. And I think back to, like a lot of like Gerald Horne's work, like, the counter-revolution of 1776 and the apocalypse of settler colonialism, and the way that he talks about how, it was in response to indigenous, rebellion and Black rebellion, right, for freedom, for self-determination, that really the United States forms, comes from a settler colony into a nation, into an imperial nation, in response to sort of trying to crush and stop these kinds of rebellions. And so I only say that because I think of anti-communism, you can't separate it from like settlerism. You can't separate it from thinking about that it's settler alliances, right? It's all Europeans of all ranks, come together and unify and have solidarity to make sure that Black, and indigenous and other colonized people don't get free. And that's really sort of, I think, it comes to be more known and more overt as anti-communist strategy, in the 20th century and today. But it's sort of always, I would just say it's always been there in that kind of unity among settlers to crush, the liberation movements of the people who have done all the work and whose land, makes all this possible, who's been stolen, So I would just add that. And then I think, this is a great question about kind of a contemporary or like maybe a present moment, to kind of focus on. And I just want to mention one quick thing that I've been thinking about, for a while, ever since the summer of 2020, and the abolition rebellions that happened that were so powerful, millions of people into the streets all around the world. Really, it was rehearsals for the kind of power that poor and working class people have to really take control and run things, right? These were rehearsals, and it really terrified the ruling class that people had this kind of power. And so what I think is important to think about is this: we need to study, I would say we need to study really the sort of response of the ruling class to these rebellions. And what I mean by that is, a lot of people have focused on, the violent state repression that we saw. And I think that's important to focus on and study, and that's there. But I don't think we've studied enough, like the kind of, what I think Dr. CBS was kind of referring to as like soft power, right? Or the kind of counterinsurgency strategy that the ruling class has used in response to these things. And I would just say, like, one of the things that I think they've done very effectively, but if we studied it, we might be able to have, guide strategy to counteract it, is just there's been a widespread campaign, I think, to capture and redirect a lot of that raw militant rebellion into reformism in order to avoid, that rebellion turning into more organized, protracted struggle. And one of the things that they did is they separated abolition from anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist socialist struggle, right? So they've attempted to sort of be like, oh, abolition is its own thing over here, separate from, a socialist anti-imperialist struggle. And I think that they've done all this through an anti-communist strategy. And what I mean by this is that, people were made to believe that abolition organizing is its own separate thing from the goal of abolishing capitalism and imperialism. And that, you know, of course, when you separate that, it just leads to reformism and thus defeat, right? But that separation of abolition from anti-capitalism and anti-imperialist struggle was done through anti-communism. And so, you know, basically like the message, and this is kind of from like, you know, on the ground experience from some of the stuff that, you know, we've been doing is, you know, the message is, you know, don't be a radical extremist domestic terrorist like those calling for the abolition of police. You know, don't be in that camp. Don't be with that crowd. Like that's too radical to do. And you're going to face a lot of problems. So you have to sort of separate yourself and kind of be in the camp of reformism. And that's sort of what has happened. So for example, you know, here locally here in central PA, just to give you a concrete example of this, and I think it's happened all over, but just to give you a concrete example, you know, our group like Allegheny's Abolition, you know, I think we've tried our best to kind of hold that line of, you know, we are organizing to do what we can here, do our part and be useful to, you know, challenge capitalism and imperialism here. In response to that, the local petty bourgeois class that runs this area, you know, they ran a big campaign characterizing our work as like outside agitators to be feared. I mean, they were like had flyers and they're posting them up and they were like running it on social media that our group was like these outside agitators. I mean, it was like language directly copied from like, you know, the 1950s US South. And we, you know, we reflected on this, and the goal really with what they were trying to do is to get people to withdraw support from us, to isolate us. You know, they want to separate us from the people we would want to organize. And I think that all operates or pivots on this kind of anti-communist strategy. It was like, oh my gosh, don't mess with those people. They're communists. They're up to trouble. It's going to make things worse. And it's, you know, it's better to just sort of either, you know, directly oppose them through violence, right? That's like the far right, you know, strategy. Or it's better just to be like a reformist and not get in that kind of trouble they're going to get you in. And in some sense, you know, it's effective. In other sense, it's not, if you can kind of counteract it. But I feel like following 2020, you know, this is a strategy that I think the ruling class has really used, you know, that it kind of chilled, I think, a lot of like what was raw militant, you know, rebellion that could have sort of found its way more into organized, protracted struggle. But this anti-communist strategy has done a good job at chilling that and separating people out. So I think it's something we should maybe study, you know, for the long term and how to counteract that.
Damn. Thanks, y'all. Feeling my brain swelling. Our next question, I'll pop this in the chat, is finding good information can be challenging while living in the heart of the US empire. And I know I, for one, have been concerned in the past reading stories of alleged repression of Black African folks and LGBTQIA2S artists in China and Cuba, for example. So how do we situate the news that we hear about these countries in the context of imperialism and anti-communist propaganda and agenda? And following that, what sources do you all use or recommend to find out what's, you know, going on with the context of those things? Thank you. You want to start us out again, Erica?
Yeah. Well, when I hear those kind of questions, I'm always reminded of, in Maurice Bishop Speaks, Maurice Bishop talks about having traveled to America and just being like flabbergasted by the amount of propaganda. And he himself had even said that the US is like the most propagandized country in the world because of the amount that is funneled to us daily in every aspect of our lives. And when that was said, that was like over 30 years ago. So you can only imagine the situation now. We have social media involvement as well. But I think like how we interfere with that, because I think because we are that propagandized and because we don't have the power of the apparatus of the mainstream media, who in part works at behest of the ruling class and corporations and the state in general. It's the arm of the state, mainstream media. I'm reminded of Kwame Nkrumah, who sort of envisioned journalists or African journalists to be revolutionary political actors, in the sense that our African or revolutionary press must carry out revolutionary purposes. So in that aspect, it's just to break through all of that. If we have the clarity or the understanding that we are propagandized, then we need to, out propagandize. It's really a battle of media. It really is, and we can't concede to these sort of spaces. Like, even though I loathe social media at times, I understand that is where it's happening. When we look at Hood Communist was removed from Twitter, right? But that is where the conversations are happening, and the purpose is that people like myself and the collective of Hood Communists and other leftists, the purposes of removing them is because we are breaking through that mainstream media conversations that are happening, or how people don't even understand that they haphazardly slip into anti-communist rhetoric, right? Through rhetoric of lived experience, or trying to fight internal battles that are not theirs because they don't even live in those nations, right? But they have the sort of one-to-one perspective of just solely living in the empire. They understand everything through that. So that's how they're activated and motivated to move out. So I think, speak out. And I think that having that sort of revolutionary media apparatus, like Unmasking Imperialism, like Hood Communists, like Black Agenda Report, like Black Power Media, like Last Dope Intellectual, et cetera, and then also, supporting each other's work, because we don't have obviously the money or the networking that mainstream media has, but we do have our own individual networks that we can support and share, and just getting that information out. Because when we talk about what's going on with Cuba, one of the things that Hood Communist has done in preparation for what we know is coming on the 15th is already prepare a syllabus for people to pass around, to get informed, to know what's coming on the 15th, because we know that that's coming. Those are the type of things that I think that revolutionary media could do to sort of break that tide. Because if we're talking about instances of, Afro-Cubans in ways that Afro-Cubans have never been discussed before, then yeah, we definitely need to know what's going on with Afro-Cubans, right? And the one way that we can know about that is connecting through organizations. I definitely think that people who are involved in revolutionary media should also be involved in organizing and organizations, because that is how we find out the information that's not being told. That's how we find out the stories that's not being, shed light on. But yeah, I think it's very, very important that we support and continue to uphold revolutionary media and independent spaces that tell the truth, especially when we know that if they lie on us, as you just said about the uprisings of last year, the lies are unfolding as we speak, then they're very much capable of lying globally on about what geopolitics and foreign policy.
So I guess I'll go next. I think Erica was spot on. It's important to go beyond the realm of appearances and delve into the essence of things, because things are not always the way they make it seem in mainstream media. And even Karl Marx, one of my favorite Marx quotes, he says, quote, "All science would be superfluous if the outward appearance and the essence of things directly coincided." In other words, everything science would be completely unnecessary if the way things appear to be and the way they actually are the same thing. And they're not. When we look at something, a phenomena happening, when we look at hashtag SOS Cuba, when we look at the color revolutions, there's a particular appearance. It makes it seem like it's the underdog against the empire. It's the pro-democracy freedom fighters against tyrant and a dictator and somebody who's horrible, when in reality it's the opposite. And I think Malcolm X has probably one of my favorite quotes of all time. I quote it all the time. It's just something that I think more people really need to have in mind. And it goes, quote, "The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and to make the guilty innocent." And I think this is a quote that a lot of people really have to remember next time that they accuse China of, quote unquote, having a genocide, the next time they accuse Cuba of having systemic racism against oppressed nationalities, the next time they accuse Nicaragua of oppressing opposition protesters, and the same with Venezuela and the same with Zimbabwe. The mainstream media, the corporate entities, are owned by huge multinational banking institutions. General Electric, Raytheon, all these huge companies that benefit from making war, that benefit from endless nonstop invasions, coups, privatizing, even looking at companies like Coca-Cola and Nestle, companies that are involved in privatization and neoliberalism. They own mainstream media. They own the New York Times, they own the Washington Post, they own all of these quote unquote credible sources. So all of the credible sources that we get in US society are all corporate owned entities owned by Raytheon, Boeing, and the biggest profiteers of war. So we have to understand that. That's so crucial to understanding, because you always have to follow the money. Because whenever somebody's getting paid to write something, whenever somebody's getting paid to produce something, there's always an agenda. There's always an agenda, because sometimes the narrative and the script is the most important thing. Because what do we know? And even Malcolm X talks about this. The best way to control people is through fear. When you get people into a state of fear or in an emotional state, when you make them feel upset or sad. Do y'all remember 2013, 2014? There was this image of a young Syrian boy who was covered in dust, and he was in the back of an ambulance. And mainstream media nonstop was saying this child was gassed by the Assad regime. Every single outlet was saying this: Assad chemical weapons, Assad chemical weapons, Assad chemical weapons. So they have the power through word magic to associate Assad with chemical weapons. And it turns out not only was this kid not gassed and not attacked by the quote unquote Assad regime, his family were supporters of President Assad and the Syrian Arab Republic and the anti-imperialist government in Syria. And when this came out, they spoke out against it, and they were saying, "You're using my kid for your political campaign for imperialism. What's going on with that?" The images that were coming out of the 2018 coup attempt in Nicaragua were actually from Honduras, were protesters in Honduras protesting a right-wing neoliberal government. They were using those pictures and saying that it was Nicaragua. The same thing happened in Venezuela, where pictures of the US invasion of Iraq, where we used to say that Venezuelan troops were killing and murdering innocent people in Venezuela. So the media is, as Malcolm X said, the most powerful entity on earth. There's a reason why the richest man in the US and arguably the world, Jeff Bezos with Amazon, invests a lot in Washington Post. There's a reason why Mark Zuckerberg just announced metaverse and controlling information, because when you control the media, you control people's minds. And when you control people's minds, you can get them to support whatever system benefits you. And we know that the big companies that run the media have an interest in creating a global dictatorship of capitalism, a global open air prison of low-wage workers, of police state, of racism that we're already seeing in the urban areas, the inner cities of the US, in Palestine, and all over the global South. They want to make that globally, and they want to expand imperialism. And the only way they can do that is to do two things. A, to misinform you, right? To purposely give you false information so that they make you think that your enemies are Daniel Ortega, that your enemies are the Cuban Revolution and President Maduro, and make you think that your friends are these celebrities, these billionaires that don't care about you, that they don't know you, they don't care about you, but yet you're their fans, you're their friends, right? And that's the one aspect. The other aspect is distraction, to overstimulate you. There was these articles that came out about TikTok giving young women in particular tics, and it's really sad to hear about that. And the social media addiction, the overstimulation, we're being bombarded with information every day. So what that does is that creates a situation where if we're told that there's a genocide taking place in China, if we're told that the anti-imperialist governments of Nicaragua and Bolivia are clearing indigenous lands to create a canal or a highway, we're not going to take the time to do that investigation, to look into it, because we've already been so overstimulated with 50 TikTok videos and so much other bite-sized content that we're not going to take the time to look into that. And that process of saturation is designed to dumb us down, to hold us back. So misinformation and distraction as tools by mainstream media who are in control, the capitalists and the imperialists who control that is the main weapon of deception. So I compel people to remember Malcolm X's words. The media is the most powerful entity on earth. They have the power to make the innocent guilty and the guilty innocent. And we have to remember that whenever we hear any stories about so-called genocides or horrible things by anti-imperialist governments. And most importantly, there's never going to be a revolution that the New York Times endorses. There's never going to be a revolution that the Washington Post endorses, because their interests are completely antithetical to ours as a international working class. They're always going to demonize it no matter what. And that's important to keep in mind. And lastly, I would say as alternatives, of course, 100% support. And that this is part of the contradiction of capitalism and imperialism, that even Lenin said himself, that the capitalists and the imperialists create the tools and weapons which the working class can seize and use to kill the capitalists and the imperialists. And that's why I'm so happy to see Hood Communists. I'm so happy to see AAPRP New Mexico and Black Power Media and Black Agenda Report and the Kiao Collective and De La Sud and Troika and Gaosachun and Press TV and CGTN and so many other outlets that are doing amazing things without the backing of the military industrial complex, without corporate financing, because even though the capitalists and the imperialists use these tools to oppress us, we can seize them and use them to create an alternative, to build dual power. And we're doing that. More people are probably watching this now within our base than CNN or MSNBC, which I think is something that's good. So this is what it's about, seizing the means away from the capitalists and using it against their own system.
Yeah, and I would just kind of add, that's a great point. I don't want to forget that, like thinking of media as like dual power. I think that's a great idea, and how to put to use. I was going to mention some things about that to another answer about dual power, but I think this is a great question as well. And I would just kind of quickly add that I in terms of like sources and alternatives, I think like off the bat, all the ones you already mentioned. But I try to also think about like, how, getting analysis and getting sort of information from people who are like, grounded in the struggle, right? Who are embedded within the movements, who are there like, on the front lines, or who are like actually doing something, who are actually doing the work. They're the ones that are going to sort of know what's going on, because they're doing the study. That study is guiding, their action, and then their action, they're coming back and they're producing media analysis and things like this, where they're learning from their action. Those are the people you want to listen to, because they know what's going on. So of course, all the outlets you already mentioned, those are the people. Like I try to watch the weekly Pan-African news every chance I get, ever since it started, like in the middle of the pandemic. So that's one I would shout out again. You check that out. I'm just basically tonight repeating a lot of things I've already just learned from that show. So, but also I would say, this question as well, that, it made me think about like how anti-communist propaganda kind of functions in the way that like these corporate news outlets, just mass produce this kind of anti-communist propaganda. And like, what's its function? And to me, one of the functions is it really undermines internationalism. That's and specifically like undermining like solidarity with the global South. And so, and I kind of speak here about like, here I'm kind of speaking more to like the white left, right? Or like white revolutionaries. And what I mean by this is like this kind of anti-communist propaganda is really about preventing people from imagining that colonized people and non-Europeans are revolutionary actors, or that like, seeing that African and Indigenous and other colonized people's liberation movements as frontline or vanguard class struggles. A lot of this anti-communist propaganda, like it stunts our imagination that that's possible, right? Like we can't imagine that Cuba, the Venezuela, the people in Bolivia, the people, around the world and global South would be capable of doing this, right? And so it sort of like, it gets, and it breaks that kind of solidarity we would be offering if we were to believe that, right? it also, stops us from thinking about like how we asking a question of like, well, how can we be useful for these struggles here in the heart of empire? So if we already think that, oh, well, they're not doing socialism right, it's sort of like, that demonization of these non-white socialisms, it really lets us off the hook here to not do anything to help or be useful. It's very easy to be like, oh, well, I don't think they're doing socialism right. That's not really socialism. So if you don't think they're doing socialism, you're like, well, they're not my comrades. I don't really care. And then you don't do anything about it. You don't think like, how can I help? How am I being useful here? I only say that just because it also then stops us from thinking like, what is our relationship to the U.S. imperialist state that's violently attacking to destroy these non-European, non-white socialisms? What's our relationship to that? How do we benefit? What are we doing here? On those kinds of things. So I think that, like, again, I guess to kind of repeat is, not getting the right information and kind of following this kind of anti-communist propaganda that's just being pumped out, on these kind of corporate platforms. It has a specific political function to just sever any attempts of people to be in solidarity with people who need it. Yeah, so I'd say that.
Thank y'all so much for the incredible answers. I can't believe we're only on the second question because I feel like the conversation has been so rich, so amazing, beyond my wildest dreams. So next question that we have for y'all is Dr. CBS in her talk, which again, Dr. Charisse Burton-Stelly, talked about how any movement that challenges the status quo power of the US, especially on the left, were labeled as anti-communist and subjected to anti-communist oppression and violence. Where do you see this legacy impacting social justice organizing today? And I'll have Erica start us off again.
Yeah, well, I think that a lot of the challenges that we're faced with, especially like if for one example, the uprising, right? And the entire push for defunding of policing, and now it has been subjugated or tied directly to socialism, right? So there's now nobody wants to touch or be within arm's reach of defunding policing because it is tied to socialism now. I think those aspects that we see, those little examples of it, are how they manifest or how the US is able to maintain a sort of state power. But then also I think that anti-communism, as Charisse explained, is sort of a part of the American fabric. I can't recall, now that I'm fully aware of it, I can't really recall a show or sitcom that I grew up watching, including Sex and the City, that does not have some sort of red baiting going on. So I think that just acknowledging that it's part of the American fabric, or that it's part of the American infrastructure, anti-communism as a whole, and that because of that, that makes us susceptible to analyzing things through that view. I think that people who consider themselves on the left sort of have this view that they can't be susceptible to anti-communism, right? Because they are leftists, but they are leftists within an empire that is aggressive towards nations that are building socialist projects or attempting to establish some sort of sovereignty. So when we understand that, then we can clearly see that a lot of the anti-communist rhetoric from like self-identifying socialists or communists is not new. So these struggles that we're having online that are like fruitful at some most points, because a lot of it is circling the drain, they're reactionary, of course, but they're not new. There's just, what we're seeing is like a relatively recent trend of rejecting intellectualism, rejecting revolutionary theory, rejecting actually engaging what communism is. So I think to combat that, we need to go back to the basics. And I think starting this entire conversation and panel off with, so what is communism, right? Because I had to stop and think, well, what is the most simplest way I could explain it? Because I'm not always having to explain it, because I'm in groups where people sort of either understand anti-communism or understand how it functions or have an idea of how it functions. But I don't think we really sit down and say, this is what anti-communism is. Just like we don't really sit down and often and say, this is what imperialism is. And that's why people relatively new to movement spaces within the last 5 years consider imperialism, because it is talked about much more. The actual word is being used as something that's new. Like, this is just a new trend that of being anti-imperialist is some new thing, not understanding because they do not engage revolutionary theory, or they do not engage in these histories of of communist movements globally, or even within the US. They don't have any historical context, so they're not tied to these traditions. So that's why we keep having these same debates that were already dealt with and already handled and already, we already came to some clarity and understanding. And it's also primarily why we're waging the same wars against the state that we've already won in the sense of community control, right? Because we don't know these histories, we're not tied to this. And that in itself, that sort of anti-intellectualism that's being pushed currently is a format of anti-communism. So encouraging more people to engage in political education and political education groups and these study groups and joining these panels, and then encouraging more people to have one-on-one conversations with folks, because that really is what we need. I think a lot of the conversation is people using a lot of language for no reason, just to have discourse, right? But the purpose of what we're doing is not about discourse, it's about revolution. So we need to start moving towards that. And I think the most basic way is to get back to the basics. And I think that that's one way that we can address what Dr. CBS was speaking to.
Definitely agree on that point. I think it's important always to define terms: anti-imperialism, imperialism, capitalism, socialism. And within the left, I think sometimes we get into too much jargon whenever we're explaining things. Even for myself, I try to watch how I speak, especially to younger generation of people. And it's not because I think I'm better or smarter, or we think we're better or smarter because we understand certain terms, but we want to explain things to the most oppressed working class people in the hoods and the barrios who understand these concepts but just don't have the words for them. I've met people in New York, in the Bronx, in Queens, in LA, East LA, who have never read a single word of Marx or Lenin and understand the concepts of Marx and Lenin better than these stuffy liberal academics who call themselves Marxists in academia, because they understand what it means to be from a working class perspective. They understand what it means to be humiliated by people in positions of power. And it's something that we always have to get away from dogma and from being so strict in our understandings of words and using it more freely. I think that it's interesting because throughout the history of the US, the quote unquote United States of America, there has been always resistance to this empire. The United States is not any other nation. We can't compare the history of the US to Zimbabwe. We can't compare it to Grenada or Nicaragua. We can't compare it to Brazil or any other nation. Although other nations have a history of settler colonialism and they have obviously roots of slavery and genocide, to compare those countries to the US, the preeminent imperialist power today, and that flag that represents horror and chaos to people around the world, we can't compare the two. And throughout the history of the US, there's been so many forms of resistance, mainly the indigenous peoples, the African peoples, working class peoples, in defense of their nation and for sovereignty. And it's interesting because I think there's been a shift in how the US imperialist forces have used the term communist in opposing any form of challenges from the left. After 1917 and up until 1991, which was the duration of the Soviet Union being the main counterweight to the US imperialist empire, anyone who was in any way protesting unjustness or poverty or anything or racism in the US was immediately accused of being a communist. They were red baited. They were, and sometimes charged with treason. They were attacked. They were murdered. We know about the COINTELPRO operations that targeted this in particular hardest, the Panthers and the Black Liberation Movement, and also the Young Lords and the Brown Berets. It was very ruthless, and it used more of a campaign of fear, of painting communism as people eating babies and mass murders and atheism and all this crazy stuff. And that was during the duration of the Soviet Union, because there was a real fear within the United States that the Soviet Union would build more and more influence within the US, because we know, for example, that the Black Panther Party, they were international communists, right? They weren't just about Black liberation, they were about Marxism, Leninism. They studied the works of Kim Il-sung. They traveled to the DPRK. They were in solidarity with Palestine. They were scientific socialists. Read Huey Newton, read Fred Hampton. These are serious MLs who studied it. And so what happens is that after 1991, after the Soviet Union is destroyed, and after there's no longer this preeminent threat of a huge socialist country by the US, or what it deems to be socialist, the tactic kind of switches. So instead of trying to push away any sort of protest or resistance, the liberals were very slick and very innovative. And they said, look, if we don't control these people, it's better to have controlled opposition than to have an opposition that we can't control. An opposition that will work with other countries around the world, that will do something that is against our interest. And so we have the NGOification of resistance. The US has more NGOs than any other country in the world. And in a way, it serves as an exhaust pipe for US imperialism and capitalism, bringing people back to reform, serving as the outfielders for the Democratic Party. And this strategy has been very useful for the imperialists, because now, instead of just outright calling something communist, and I'm talking in particular to the liberal democratic wing of the US imperialist empire, now instead of just rejecting them like how they did in the 50s and 60s with the ACLU and others, now they're like, let me learn from you. Let's use your imagery. Let's steal your branding. And let's rewrite your history. So now you have attempts to rewrite revolutionary communist groups like the Black Panther Party, like the Brown Berets, like the Young Lords, that were not just about civil rights and fighting for equality within this empire. They wanted to overthrow this empire. And that's what's missing in so much of the post-Cold War narratives by the liberal establishment. And so I think this form of anti-communism is even more dangerous, right? Because what they were doing, what the US was doing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, by calling people like Paul Robeson and others, other great leaders who were radicalized by the US empire, they were like, you're a communist, you're a communist, you're a communist. And then after a while, people who weren't even communists to begin were like, huh, you know what? Maybe I am a communist. Let me go to these socialist and communist countries. And they actually embraced it. And that's what happened. And that's why during the 50s and 60s, communism was so popular and so widespread. So the liberals and the NGOs were brilliant in their evilness and understanding. Instead of trying to just push them away, right? We're pushing them toward something that we don't want them to go to. Let's bring them in. Let's create these institutes for social justice. Let's create these NGOs. Let's control this opposition in a way that brings it always back to vote for a representative, call your representative. We're gonna bring justice at the ballot box. And it never talks about overthrowing the system, only reforming it. So I think even though, yes, historically, any form of challenge to the status quo has always been labeled as communist and in very horrible ways, right? People have been attacked, killed for that. I think we're in a stage now where it's even worse for the communist movement, because now they're trying to co-opt the imagery and the symbolism, justice and democracy, and they're trying to say that capitalism represents that the free market represents that, instead of the socialist, anti-imperialist countries, which they brand as authoritarian, as violent, as dictatorial, as backward. And so there's been a complete inversion, and I think we have to really be aware of that.
Those are such great responses. You know, I was going to add something. I think it's very similar, but like a little different in the sense I kind of the other side of the coin a little bit. I think from what Ramiro was saying, and I was thinking about this question of, you know, just the anti-communist oppression and violence, and the kind of the way it impacts social justice organizing today. You know, I think following Dr. CBS's talk, and you know the way that, you know, she talked about sort of anti-communist governance going from a federal down to local levels, right? You know, it got me thinking how we also should be, you know, looking at the role of mass-based fascisms operating independent of the state in carrying out anti-communist oppression. And that's kind of the other side of the coin, I think, from what Ramiro was saying, right? So you get like the liberal nonprofits doing their thing, but there's also, right, you know, there's mass-based fascisms that have resurged. They never went away. I mean, it's always just been colonial violence, right? But you know, it takes on different forms. But you know, this fascism, I would say, has always just been settlerism in the United States. And I would understand sort of settlerism, you know, like I said earlier, I understand it's kind of this cross-class settler alliances that really enabled the emergence of racial capitalism, you know, by organizing settlers of all ranks to repress Black and Indigenous liberation struggle. So today, you know, fascism as settlerism, it seeks to save racial capitalism. And I bring that up because, you know, it's not necessarily that it means, you know, helping the state to target those fighting for social justice who might be labeled as communists the way we've been talking about it. But it's more so like these fascisms, you know, they think of themselves as taking it upon themselves as a fascist movement to crush movements for liberation, not just only helping the state, but also just crush it because they feel like the state doesn't do enough, right? And that's what I mean by they're kind of independent of the state. They're very insurgent against the state as well. And I want to bring that up because, you know, those are actual, you know, mass-based movements that are premised on anti-communist, you know, violence, right? They see anybody organizing for social justice as communist in the way we've been talking about it. And that characterization justifies their violence against people who would fight for that. I think what's interesting, or what's to take note of, is, you know, the way that racialization and colonization works is, you know, some people, the way that they're just positioned, right, through colonization, racialization makes them communist targets, right? Whereas people who are not colonized and racialized, you know, have to actually act against empire to be characterized as communist in the eyes of these fascists. And so I want to bring that up because, you know, and I don't want to get into the details of this, but, you know, I've been watching the Rittenhouse trial a little bit, right? And I only did that because, you know, I think it's important to understand sort of how these people think and what they're, you know, how they operate. To kind of, you know, you have to know your enemy a little bit, right? So I was interested to sort of see what was going on with that. And I was listening to his testimony. And what struck me is, you know, he didn't really show up in Kenosha to protect property like he claims. I mean, maybe in his head he thought so, but he's really, I think he's shown up to sort of do this repressive violence that would scare people into not rebelling for liberation. He's upset that poor and oppressed people, you know, were out there doing a rehearsal in the streets for taking control and running things, you know, and that really motivates him to show up to stop that. So in his mind, if poor and colonized people win freedom, you know, he loses his whole world. And I think that, you know, January 6th, the Capitol attack is really the same thing. You know, that was a rehearsal for what they aim to do, which is to capture the state and institute a more direct form of racial capitalism. You know, neoliberalism isn't really cutting it for them anymore. And so they're going to fight to save a world that they feel like, and it's true, communism is trying to end. And so I'll bring that up because I think it's important to think about like the way, like the terrain we're on, if we're organizing for social justice, is to not only think about the imperialist state, the settler state, the neoliberal state, but also to think about these mass-based fascisms that seek to sort of overthrow and take control of the state themselves. But to do so, they have to look at, you know, they're going to look at any sort of, you know, movement for social justice as their enemy to crush and kill and eliminate. And so, you know, we have to, and I want to bring that up because it's like, again, kind of talking to, you know, white revolutionaries or, you know, white workers, white leftists out there, you know, that's on us to organize in these areas to undermine that. I mean, you know, the communities that produce Rittenhouse, you know, we got to be there in organizing so he doesn't get produced. So he's not showing up in the first place. You know, I mean, they're organizing people to show up and do that kind of violence. They're trying to save their world from, again, like the world that communism is trying to end that world. They're trying to save their world. They're going to do anything they can to do it. And so I think, like, what's our role to really undermine the way that these areas serve as bases for fascist organizing? And I don't bring that up because, here in central Pennsylvania, I mean, a mile or two down the road, there's this big, billboard that says, Trump or communism, beware, right? And so, they kind of know what's going on in the sense of, like, neoliberalism isn't going to work out. And they're organizing people to, sort of save racial capitalism from the way that capitalism's contradictions are bringing it down. And the question becomes, are we organizing an alternative for people? Are we organizing something that people can fall into and not fall into that? And if we can do that, then, then there's less Rittenhouses out there. And it makes it much easier for Black and Indigenous liberation and colonized liberation movements to win. And that's what we should be about.
Yeah, thank y'all. We're gonna move into our last question. So we'll kind of wrap up this conversation. And I will put it here in the chat. Given the centuries-long history of anti-communism and leftist oppression in the US, and against the background of increasing US aggression against Africa, Cuba, China, and more, what can we effectively do right now to challenge the US empire and move towards socialism within the heart of the empire? And what, if anything, gives you hope in this struggle?
Well, truthfully, I don't know if the U.S. could be saved. I don't know if the empire would collapse completely, given the expansion of the military apparatus. But I know the social infrastructure of empire will. And I think that Oliver made such a great point towards the end about having, we have to offer people something, because if that is the ultimate conclusion, if socialism cannot be built here, then what? Because it is socialism or barbarism, right? So if we understand that, then how do we get our people prepared? And I think that is the aspect of socialism that is least talked about, is the armed struggle aspect of socialism, that I think that we really need to emphasize when we're having these conversations, especially if we're going to talk about the purpose and utility of the far right, and how organized they are. So I do feel like, when we talk about being peace, we understand that peace cannot exist without the absence of the violent conditions that we're under, right? So we ultimately are going to have to fight back. So I think that regardless if socialism is able to be built, that infrastructure within our organizing communities needs to be. And without that, I really don't see. And then I also feel like if we understand that, socialism can't be built here, I think this is even more of a call for internationalism, because then what happens to us if we're isolated in a dying empire, right? If collapsing socially and infrastructurally, what's going to happen to us? So I think that that's why we need to emphasize more on internationalism, and in the United Socialist Africa, especially as Africans, because we understand that is where our power lies. If something were to happen to us, we have a home base, and so that's where my head is around that question. But truthfully, I don't see socialism happening here within empire. I don't think they deserve it.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that what's important to remember is that, first of all, the United States was founded as not a nation, right? The United States is not a nation with one shared ethnicity and language. It's a corporation, and it's an imperial corporation founded on genocide and on settler colonialism. And the flag of the US today is actually the flag of the East India Company that was established in the 1600s. The US was basically a tax haven for right-wing libertarian types from Europe and for people who engaged in the slave trade. So the foundations of the US as a quote unquote country or nation is totally different from any other country. And I think this is important to remember because it fundamentally changes the tactical strategy of communists and anti-imperialists in the belly of the beast. I think, as Erica correctly pointed out, the revolution here is going to look totally different and is incomplete without reparations, without land back for African and indigenous peoples, without anti-imperialism and internationalism. Because as long as the United States exists as an entity, it's going to continue to oppress nations around the world. It's going to continue to operate on stolen land. It's going to continue to use Black and brown people to carry out its bidding in imperialist wars. And the very foundations of the United States were born in blood. And there cannot be socialism on land that was stolen. For example, in the quote unquote state of Israel, some of the biggest supporters of Zionism, and it's interesting, if you study the history of Zionism and Israel, some of the biggest Zionists were people on the left. They branded Israel as a leftist thing. They branded it as these communes for European settlers to go to the Middle East and build what they described as Jewish communism in occupied Palestine, which didn't reflect the true nature of the Jewish people, but they were just using this identity to carry out settler colonialism. And so it had some sort of left edge to it. And same thing with South Africa and also what they called back in the day Rhodesia and the Boers, who were Dutch and English settlers who were quote unquote rebelling against Holland and the UK. And they also branded themselves as rebelliousness and going against empire, but they were trying to build socialism, ethnic settler socialism on stolen land. And the United States is no different. And it's important to keep in mind because it changes how we approach tactics within the left, because any benefit that comes to the United States will be at the expense. The equipment we're using right now, the plastic that's on this microphone, the shirt on my back, everything that we're using to even have this conversation right now is the rubbers from the Philippines, the wood is from Brazil, right? The pieces of technology in our phones and our laptops are taken from Africa, from Congo. Everything that is accrued here, the material wealth of the imperial core nations, is based on the extraction of the periphery. Walter Rodney talks about this in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And this is part of the understanding of dependency theory, that it's not just workers and capitalists equally oppressed in every single country. There is, as even Marx himself talks about, an unevenness within quote unquote development. There's a more privileged class in the US compared to Africa or Asia or Latin America. With that in mind, that doesn't mean that we stop organizing, right? Because when you point that out, people will say, well, okay, so what, do nothing? Does that mean that we stop? No, it means that our role is different. And I think we can look at historical examples to see how others have approached this. A great microcosm that I think is important to bring here is the Cuban Revolution. We all know about the Cuban Revolution. We all see the images of the guerrilla fighters in the jungles and the mountains, La Sierra Maestra, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and others who were in the rural part of Cuba, in the periphery. And we tend to focus only on that part of the revolution, which is a crucial part of it. However, part of the Cuban Revolution that's almost never talked about, but was very important, was the role of the communist underground in Havana, in Santiago, in the cities, in the urban areas. They weren't out there waving guns. They weren't even wearing communist clothing or anything. They were working underground and they had a role. It wasn't the sexiest role, right? They weren't personified. We don't even know their names, right? Some of them, Enrique Oltuski was one of them. He worked for Shell. He was a quote unquote businessman and he was supporting the communist guerrillas in the countryside clandestinely. And this is important because this is, if we take this approach and without the cities, without the financing, the fundraising from Havana, from Santiago, underground, right in the face-to-face interactions with Batista, with the enemy, without that help and support, that lifeline, that solidarity, the revolution in the countryside would have been impossible because they didn't have that support from the belly of the beast of Batista's regime. Now, if we apply this to the international scale, as the Chinese revolutionary Lin Biao mentions, surrounding the global city, right? North America, Europe, Australia, quote unquote, Israel, from the global countryside, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, we can use this logic and organize within the belly of the beast. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that we're pessimistic. It doesn't mean that we're trying to just sit on our ass and do nothing. It means that our role is different. It means that instead of being the leading cast, I like to compare it to a play, right? If you go to a theater, there's a play, the leading protagonists of the global socialist movement have been and continue to be, to this day, Black and brown women in the global South mainly. If you look at the most radical movements around the world, look at the strike in India that had 250 million people. That was mainly Indian women in the Communist Party of India Marxists that led that. You look at the Sandinista revolution, the Bolivarian revolution, Venezuela, Cuban Revolution, Black and brown women, working class women in Asia, everywhere. The proletariat, the face is overwhelmingly women, working class from the global South, and men, of course, but mainly women who are at the forefront of that. We have to have, as scientific socialists, the humility to say, you know what? Our role in the belly of the beast is not going to be the leading protagonist role. We're not going to be the main actors. We're going to be the supporting cast, right? Maybe we'll pull the rope, maybe we'll pull the curtain, but at the end of the show, we're all going to take the bow together. And this is something that I think is lost within the United States, where people in the US in particular are so used to being the center of attention and the center of everything that we have to be the main focus, where it's like, no, like people in these global South nations are doing revolution right now as we speak. And our best role as anti-imperialists is to support them, is internationalism. Anti-imperialism is the primary contradiction, as Mao Zedong said. And as communists within the imperial core, the best thing we can do is be in solidarity with Iran, with Zimbabwe, with Angola, with Venezuela, with Cuba, Nicaragua, DPRK, with Yemen, Iran, China, Russia, all these nations that are resisting empire, not have some ideological checklist and say, that country is not good enough for me, or take a chauvinist view and say, I don't care about these other places, I just care about my own local little area. We have to be internationalists, and I think this is the best way.
Yeah, and I would just echo again what Erica and Ramiro said, about it's about really how do we support and be in solidarity with the global South. I mean, the only thing I would just quickly add, so we have some time for questions here, is just that in response to this question that was posed, I thought of a specific weekly Pan-African news episode that aired a while back, and I think it's titled something like, from mobilization to organization or something like this. And it's a very good episode. And what I remember from it, or for me, what I think about is, I think that this is sort of what I'm sort of speaking to, like what I think I'm trying to do in my contributions in the areas I'm in terms of organizing power to challenge capitalism and imperialism, is, moving away from mobilization and into organization, especially, following 2020 and following the pandemic. A lot of people, it's like reacting, but not sort of trying to build like long-term dual power infrastructure. And I think that that's really important to do, is to try to build this long-term dual power infrastructure as a tool for waging struggle. So political education infrastructure, care and survival networks, security, conflict resolution, mutual aid, community defense against state, gender, colonial, and fascist violence, housing defense, legal defense, prisoner support, and so on. These kind of concrete, on the ground, tangible material infrastructure that I really feel like creates greater stability and unity among poor and working class people. That's just so necessary to make that move towards socialism. So much of what we do depends on capitalism and imperialism destabilizing, us. And so we don't have that kind of infrastructure that can help us wage struggle. So I think I only say that because, like, instead of waiting around for bourgeois politicians, instead of waiting around for the state, instead of waiting around for like these self-proclaimed leaders to solve the problems, we ourselves now have to just organize the capacity to do something. And I think that building that kind of infrastructure does that. And so I actually have hope that even though, we're facing these worsening conditions and contradictions are sharpening, people are taking action in response. They are reacting. and they do have a desire for total transformation. I think it is getting harder to convince people that reform and that electoral politics is going to save us. I just think that like they see that those routes really aren't working. I just think that, again, like I said this before, I think we have to just build the groups, the projects, and the infrastructure that can turn this frustration into organized and disciplined struggle. And I think once we start winning, that's the last thing that the ruling class wants, is when people win, that really inspires other people to move. That's why they like can't stand, like that's why like Assata Shakur is like enemy number one, because she won. And they just cannot stand that. So they don't want to see anyone win. But if we can have discipline or organize and we start winning, that just spreads. That's where I find hope, at least when sometimes I'm feeling like, oh, this seems like it ain't gonna happen. So
Thanks, y'all. This has been incredible. We just wrapped up the last of our prepared questions, and we have a couple of questions for the audience. We do have a little bit less time for our Q&A than we anticipated, so we'll probably only get a chance to ask 2 of these questions. So I'll start off. First question is, Dr. Dylan Rodriguez talks about how diversity, equity, and inclusion is historically a counterinsurgency strategy on the part of the ruling class in the United States. How does this fit into the analysis y'all have been discussing in terms of imperialism and anti-communism? And I will put this question in the chat.
Yeah, if we're going, I can start first. So I talk a lot about this primarily in regards to the ways that the right uses or misuses identity politics, and it somehow has seeped into the way the left has sort of disregarded the fundamental use of identity politics and have confused it with what we are seeing with the diversity and inclusion politics that I refer to as identity reductionism, whereas everyone is reduced to some aspect of their identity in order to grasp or take hold of the masses so that they can move in whatever direction the state needs them to. And that's evident in the way that folks are responding to, for instance, what's going on with the pink tide, the way that folks are responding to Haiti primarily, discussing it in only one aspect of anti-Blackness and not looking at it through the lens of imperialism, and how Haiti is a representative of how the US is engaging the entire region. Because what they're doing to Haiti is, we can see, is being done in Nicaragua with the use of the OAS and the core group and the interference of the elections, the backing of dictatorship. Also, when we talk about Cuba and the use of Afro-Cubans, right, in ways that we've never heard a large amount of people discuss Afro-Cubans, let alone the way that they're discussing it. So I think that the inflection of diversity inclusion politics warps the way that we understand materially what's happening in these internal processes within these nations. And I believe that the American exceptionalism that we're sort of overcome with, by means of the way that we're propagandized consistently, causes us to only analyze things one-on-one. This is why we hear language of carceral state in socialist nations, right? Those things don't actually apply because people don't understand terminologies like dictatorship or the proletariat, or don't understand that the ruling class could be the workers, because they don't engage these separate nations. And that's because they understand things only on the one-on-one from the way that they interpret the US interpretation of these things. So if the US is bad on Blackness, right, in general, then the interpretation is that every nation is mishandling race issues, and then every nation has a systemic race issue, as opposed to one that's still lingering through a colonial period, where we know that the US systemically has racial issues, where that's infected in the governance. That is the way that we're understanding Cuba, because I'm Black and those people are Black, and if they're in prison, they must be because they're Black, without actually investigating. And a lot of that is due to identity reductionism, which doesn't cause or any sort of investigation into these nations. And that kind of platforms anti-communism, right? Because we don't have to investigate what's going on. We don't need any material knowledge. We don't actually need to engage these communities. We just need to know that they're Black, or we need to, if we know that there's a subsection of a Black community, these nations, then we're only analyzing the entire nation based on how they handle or mishandle the Black community. And then based on that, because we identify as Black, we sort of push for intervention. We sort of say, yeah, well, if they're mistreating Black people based on the little bit of information that I know, then obviously US intervention is the right thing to do, misunderstanding that internal processes are better handled without the US. So yeah, so that's one way I can address that.
I want to give a shout out to Erica for using the term identity reductionism. I think it's a perfect way to encapsulate how the liberal imperialist NGO industrial complex has subverted race studies and the studies of racial oppression, but at the same time acknowledging within the left that because you support African liberation or indigenous liberation doesn't mean you're some Soros liberal either. And I think it's a great way to combine class struggle with the liberation of oppressed nationalities, the national liberation movements. And I think it's the best term that I've heard to explain everything that's been going on. And it's something that is important to keep in mind because it's being used against anti-imperialist countries, against Cuba, against Venezuela and Nicaragua, for example. And it's something that, yes, there are problems within Cuban society. There is still lingering racism, but that's not because of the 60 plus years of the Cuban Revolution. It's because of the 600 years of colonialism that was on the island of Cuba. Same with Nicaragua. There's still elements or remnants of racism, a contradiction that is being overturned within the Sandinista revolution, but it's not because of the 30 years or the 20 plus years of the Sandinismo, but it's because of the hundreds of years of colonialism of the Somoza family, and same with Venezuela as well. And this is something that is important to keep in mind because it has to be framed within a dialectical understanding, a Marxist understanding that changes in society are a process. They don't happen overnight. It's not a light switch, right? And this is the problem that I have with a lot of people who claim to be left, but I would say are more ultra left, who think immediately overnight things have to be different, right? Immediately overnight, you have to get rid of the whole state apparatus. Immediately overnight, racism should be done. They believe you get a magic wand, and as soon as you take power with this magic wand, you just have to say some special words, and immediately all these problems are done away with. That's not how reality works. If we are dialectical materialists, we are scientific socialists, we observe reality as a state of change and a constant state of change and processes. In order for racism and sexism and even homophobia and transphobia to be done away with in our sister and brother nations of the global South, imperialism and colonialism has to be done away with first, because that is the root cause of that. It's not socialism. Socialism is emancipatory. Socialism is the idea that all human beings can unleash their full potential, that all of their labor should belong to the working class, the wealth and resources of society should belong to those who created, that a small group of banking elites should not be in charge of the global economy, bringing power to the most oppressed people bottom up, starting with the most oppressed up. That is what socialism is about. Capitalism rewards power. It does not care about who you are. In fact, if you come from an oppressed background, then they will only use you as a token for their system. We see this with people like AOC, also with quote unquote entrepreneurs who say, oh, I made it, I got a seat at the table, anyone can do it. And it forms part of the myth and the mythology of what is called a noble lie. This existed within the Roman Empire, where the Romans conquered all parts of Northern Africa and what is today the Middle East. And within those colonies, they established leaders from those areas. So if they colonized what is today Tunisia, they had somebody from Tunisia as the one of the mid-ranking leaders there. And the noble lie was this idea that people from the colonies of the Roman Empire could ascend to Rome. All roads lead to Rome. They could eventually leave their local post in their local Roman colony and move to Rome and become Roman senator, which is where this term, the Senate, comes from. And this mythology is also used in US imperialism. We're told that if we work hard enough, this is part of idealism, the idealism of capitalism, right? If we work hard enough, if we just think the right things, if we wear the right suit, if we speak like this and talk correctly, and we can get all of the luxuries and the resources of the wealthy capitalist imperialist elites. But I got news for you. They don't see us as equals. They do not see us as people who are in any way remotely close to them in terms of power or status. And this is the noble lie, and this is what keeps the empire flowing. This idea that people can ascend, and sure, there are a few tokens who are upheld in media as the standard, but the vast majority of Black, brown, working class people in the US do not represent that. The vast majority don't have enough money to feed their kids, to pay rent, are in student debt, like myself, are struggling to pay bills, have so many medical expenses or so many other things, police brutality. So again, this is something that, as whoever put forward the chat brilliantly said, is a mechanism used for maintaining the empire.
And I might just pass on that, but I think because you all answered it so well, and maybe to give some time for that last question.
Thank you all. Let's see, we're gonna do one more question, and this may go a little over time just to let everybody here know. And on the other side of that coin, ask that try to even further synthesize your thoughts, just so we can squeeze this last one in. This last question was posted in the chat from Reyes, and I'll put it up in there again. And the dominant part of the question is, but also what about Indigenous sovereignty, with some context in this, because not all Indigenous people are pushing towards socialism or communism. I say this not to disrespect anyone who strongly believes in either of those, but it's important to think about the territories you are organizing on, especially for those of us organizing here in the so-called US. As a descendant of Pueblo revolutionaries, we have the right and responsibility to speak on this and dismantle the empire with Indigenous community defense. Hashtag land back and water back.
Yeah, I think it's a good question to raise, because I think that it speaks to the intent of the panel, which is not to essentially make anyone communist or socialist or anything of that nature, but to instill the idea that anti-communism is so rampant that it wouldn't make a difference whether or not you're socialist or communist, and that affects all of our organizing, whether we're doing it for land back or whether we're doing it on behalf of internationalism or whatever, or Black Lives Matter or Indigenous, community defense. Anti-communism affects all of our organizing for the simple fact is, just as Sharice said earlier in the opening statement, anything radical historically, that historical context, anything radical or anything that pushes back against the status quo or challenges the state is an issue. And when it becomes an issue for the state, regardless if we all agree on what we're seeking as an end goal, just the process of our organizing makes us all equally an issue for the state. So the purpose of the panel is just to really evoke what anti-communism is, first and foremost, but also how it will affect all of us. And I'm going to wrap with this. Earlier, when I talked about Haiti, Haiti obviously is not a socialist project. Haiti is nowhere near in the process of becoming one. But the fear of any sort of sovereignty from Haiti and the connections that Haiti is making with countries that are evolving themselves in socialist projects makes Haiti a direct threat, whether or not, regardless if Haiti sees itself as a socialist or communist project. Haiti is a threat in this under that same anti-communist umbrella as the same region. So that would be my response. Whatever kind of organizing we're doing, if it's against the state, it wouldn't really be mattered whether or not we agree or align with socialism or communism. They will box us in there and move accordingly.
Definitely agree. I mean, I think it's the role of anti-imperialists and communists to, number one, respect the sovereignty of all oppressed nationalities and peoples to determine their own path. It's not for us to decide in the empire how the Venezuelans or the Cubans or the Nicaraguans or the Zimbabweans or the Iranians want to liberate themselves from imperialism. It is up to them because they know what is best for them. They know what their needs are, what their cultures are. And it's interesting because when I first came into socialism and the left, I used to be somebody who was very critical of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I was like, why are socialists and communists defending a Muslim country that says it's not socialist, that says, that doesn't have a favorable view of Marxism? And then as I'm like studying Iran and seeing what they're doing, even though, yes, they don't technically define themselves as socialist, and even though they don't use the imagery, going back to what we were talking about before, right? We have to move beyond the realm of appearances. Just because a movement or a nation or people don't define themselves as socialists or communists doesn't mean that they're not inherently revolutionary, or that their national liberation movement is not revolutionary. Because the Islamic Republic of Iran has banned finance capital. They're going against the imperialist countries, the UK, the US. They're building an alternative system. They're eliminating debt. They view debt as haram, as something that is anti-Islamic. And I agree with that. I agree that usury and debt is horrible. And I'm not going to be a Puritan and say, oh, they're not saying it exactly the way I say it, so therefore I don't support them. I'm going to respect their autonomy and their own identity to define things the way they want to do it. And it's undoubtedly the same with indigenous liberation in countries, especially in the Americas, the quote unquote Americas. For example, if we look at all of the indigenous liberation movements across the Americas today, they undoubtedly have a revolutionary character without even having to have the name socialist or communist in their title. Look at the Mapuches in Chile. The Mapuche people in Chile were some of the first to resist the Pinochet fascist dictatorship. They have been fighting for their lands of Araucanía for hundreds of years. They have been fighting against multinational companies and settlers and actual Nazis, German Nazis who have settled in Chile. So even though, okay, yes, their movement doesn't call themselves socialists or communists, they're fighting for a lot of the same things that communists and socialists are fighting for, right? Zero debt, no enslavement to corporations and foreigners, and respecting the earth, respecting the working class, respecting nature. These are things that communists also fight for and believe for. If we look at as well the role of indigenous liberation in the revolutionary movements of Peru, most of the communist movements in Peru were comprised of indigenous peoples. Guatemala, from 1960s to 1990s, the communist guerrilla movement was almost exclusively of the Maya and women, indigenous women in Guatemala. In El Salvador as well, Farabundo Martí, the founder of the Communist Party of Central America, a Marxist-Leninist, was indigenous. Sandino in Nicaragua was indigenous. And they have played a crucial role in the national liberation struggles of not just in the US, but all over. And it is up to, you can't have socialism without national sovereignty and liberation. It's something that both Lenin and Stalin have wrote about in The National Question, the foundations of Leninism. And the same applies to African peoples and respecting autonomy of the imprisoned African nations within the US and around the world. And Haiti's a great example as well. I've been to Haiti twice. I've seen the protests myself, and I can't tell you that I've seen a more revolutionary situation than any other place. People are out on the streets, have been out on the streets for years, protesting every week against the neoliberal government, burning the US flag and the French flag, saying that we're tired of the debt, we're tired of paying the quote unquote reparations to France for freeing ourselves. And the people, the movement there's not necessarily calling itself socialist or communist, but a lot of the ideas and the actions that they're doing are inherently socialist or communist. Meanwhile, you have quote unquote socialist or communist groups in the first world, in the UK, that supported the US imperialist intervention in Syria, that supported the invasion of Libya, that support the ongoing war against China. And so again, right, we have to move past labels, past appearances, and 100%, we have to, as anti-imperialists, support all national liberation struggles that are based on the true liberation of peoples from imperialism. If you're against imperialism, then you're a friend of mine. I don't care if whatever you call it, right? Whatever color you want to use for your flag, whatever name you want to use, go crazy. That's up to you. I'm not going to tell you that. But if we're fighting the same enemy, which is Wall Street, I'll be there with you.
And I would just very quickly add, in less than 30 seconds here, I don't think there is no socialist or communist movement that could call itself as such that isn't accountable to indigenous and African liberation, because capitalism and imperialism, forms, in response to, dispossessing indigenous and African people and colonized people. So like, it is a structure, it is a system that is sort of already anti-indigenous and already anti-Black. That's how it begins. And so you can't sort of say you're gonna, abolish capitalism and replace it with something else if you're not already sort of thinking along the lines of, how do I support and be accountable to indigenous and Black liberation? Because those are the struggles that are going to, do that work. And I think, again, I've said this before, like, the question becomes like, how can we sort of be useful and supportive of that and see those as class struggles and not just sort of identity, right? But those are class struggles. They're going to bring it down. So yeah, I mean, just, you have to know whose lands you're on. You have to know, how to be useful, how to be a good comrade to those kinds of struggles.
Thanks, y'all. This has been incredible. We're going to start closing down the panel now. Thank you so much for everybody that joined us and to our panelists. For our closing, I'm going to pass it to Comrade Keegan from the Anti-War Coalition.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I'm in awe of all the things that I just learned, and I'm really, really grateful to our panelists, and also, folks in the audience for having a really lively discussion. Yeah, thank you all so much. So just a couple things to note that kind of look out for from the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition. We're working on developing an anti-imperialist curriculum, and we don't know exactly what form that's going to look like, but we have all y'all's email addresses, so if it's okay, we're going to be reaching out about some of that stuff. We also are going to put together a study guide. There was a ton of a ton of information talked about during this panel, and some reading and some videos that can follow up on some of that. So in y'all's discussion groups or cadres or organizations that you're part of, you can follow up on some of that information if that's something that you'd like to do. We also, for folks who are in Tiwa territory and so-called Albuquerque or in the Southwest region, we have a rally coming up on the 21st of November, and so in solidarity with Cuba. We're seeing that the United States is literally planning to fabricate dissent and manufacture consent for U.S. Americans to go against the Cuban Revolutionary government. So that's going to happen on November 15th. So we'll be having a gathering in Tiwa territory downtown to have a facilitated discussion about that and to have comrades share about for more information about that. We also are really trying to get our YouTube to have over 100 subscribers so we can actually post videos longer than 10 minutes. So if you want to subscribe, I just threw the link down. That would be really, really helpful. so we can like, the AAPRP New Mexico has been really gracious in hosting our videos there, because they're not just 10 minutes long. And let's see, I think that's pretty much everything. I just want to thank you again to Erica, to Oliver, to Ramiro, to all the folks that joined us, and also to the interpreters, ASL interpreters, for joining us. Yeah, really, really grateful and excited to be in solidarity with you all. And yeah, that's all that I have to say. If anyone else does, if not, have a great, great evening, and be well. Take care.
All right, y'all, I'm shutting this down. Have a good night.
Thank you
Good seeing
guys.
you.
Take
See you
care.
later.
Cheers, y'all.
Everyone, no compromise, no retreat.
No compromise, no retreat.
Nice
Take
to meet
care.
you all. Thanks, Amanda and Amy.